Hi there, my friend. I'm Peter Barron. Welcome to today's episode of the Independent School Moonshot podcast. I am thrilled to be joined by Cliff Kling. He is the Senior Executive Compensation and Leadership Strategist at Mission and Data. I've had a chance to chat with Cliff a few times over the last few months. He ran a session inside of my membership around compensation and compensation structures. And, this is just one of those topics that seems to be discussed at lots of schools, trying to figure out how do you create, fair, equitable compensation structures for faculty and staff. And Cliff, I mean, is one of the foremost experts in this, knows more about it than anybody I've come across. So I'm really grateful for Cliff taking time today to talk about it and share what he's learned on the pod. So, Cliff Kling, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. Thank you so much for the opportunity to join you and looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, as am I. And we're going to get into it in just a little bit. But before we do, can you start by introducing yourself and mission and data?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start by introducing our firm. Our firm is coming up on its 5-year anniversary. We were co-founded by Ari Betoff and Kelsey Vrooman, and they are our two co-founders and owners. I was actually connected to Mission and Data through Deborah Wilson, which I'll circle back to that in a moment. But our firm now, I think, counts about 260 independent school clients, 26 or 27 membership associations, and we have 9 different practice areas that we work in, from everything from strategic planning, financial and organizational sustainability, custom dashboards, and then the practice area I launch for the firm, which is around executive compensation for heads of school and senior leadership, and faculty and staff compensation, which is the topic for today. So I joined the firm about 2 years ago. In fact, coming up, I think in about another week on my 2-year anniversary with the firm, which is really, it's been a quick 2 years. Before that, I was 24 years in 2 different independent schools. My first school, where I was for right at 18 years, I was CFO and general counsel. My previous background, previous life is I'm a former CPA. I practiced public accounting with KPMG for 2 years before going to law school. Became a lawyer, practiced law for one very long year with a large law firm, and then very quickly joined my first school way back in May of 2000 as CFO and general counsel. I did that role for 13 years. I was hired internally at Jackson Academy in Jackson, Mississippi, as the president of the school, following the 26-year president, who was my mentor and still great friend. And then had the opportunity to leave Jackson Academy and join Gulliver Preparatory School in Miami, Florida, where I was president for 6 years. Gulliver is the fifth largest school in NAIS. We had 2,230 students on 4 campuses, around 600 or so full-time employees. I think we issued something around 1,000 W-2s when you count part-time employees, and a very, very large operating budget, and so very, very complex organization. But so 24 years in those 2 schools. And so when I was leaving Gulliver, and knew that I wanted to go into consulting really because of a passion around head compensation and faculty and staff compensation. I had served on the SAIS board, and I reached out to Deborah, who at that time was still president of SAIS, and I was like, I'm thinking about going into consulting these areas. What do you think? And she said, well, if you do, I only have one firm you should talk with, and that's my friends at Mission and Data. And I spoke with them, and sort of the rest is history. So all the nice things she said about Mission and Data turned out to be very true, both before joining the firm and now sort of on the other side for 2 years. So that's sort of how I got to Mission and Data to do this work.
Yeah, I love that story. What an interesting career you had and such like diverse experience as a CPA, as a lawyer, as a head of school, like lots of different perspectives. And now you're doing all this work around compensation, which is so critical and important for lots of organizations. And so let's start here. So, when a head or a trustee says, we have to fix this, faculty and staff compensation, I guess my question to you is what problem are they usually trying to solve? And, embedded in that, I guess, is are they missing some things too as they're jumping off into this process?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think, I mean, typically when it rises, especially to the level of a trustee, I mean, I would think that the head and other senior leadership would probably understand more nuanced layers of this. But usually, if it gets to the trustee level, let's just start there. It's likely because of an issue of attrition that they're seeing in faculty and staff, lack of retention, and or a lack of hiring the preferred candidates in search cycles, right? So they're literally feeling that as we are losing faculty and staff, and we're not attracting the faculty and staff that we wish to attract at the school. That's usually sort of when it gets to the trustee level, right? It's sort of felt in that way. Before you get to that level, right, where you're actually feeling that in the form of retention or lack thereof, and also attracting high quality faculty. Oftentimes I think heads and CFOs will feel it at the level of they just know that either they've never really had a true system of sort of a faculty and staff compensation system. Everything is one off, everything is negotiated. They either never had a system, or what's more common is they had a system at one point in the past, and there was creep away from that system to where now there are lots of things sort of going on. And it usually, the creep, and we'll probably get into this in some later conversation, but there'll be especially, let's say, if you have a salary scale or step and lane system, it's all published, it's all transparent, and here's what it is. And then, you know, at some point, and it's typically, an upper level science or math teacher, resigns 2 weeks before school starts, and they're left finding someone to teach that class. And among the available candidates at that point, they're not willing to come to work for that school for that particular amount that's on the salary scale or step and lane. And so there's they drift away from that, right? And so then that starts happening more and more over time. And so heads and CFOs often say things to me like, you know, we just have, if we have 120, faculty members, we have 120 negotiated sort of contracts, or we have all these different things, or there's batches, like there's series, right? Tranches of faculty, like this group is on this
Right.
plan and this
Sure.
group is on this plan. And often what can happen is the more recently hired faculty actually are making, if not more, so close to what, faculty that have been to school 15, 20 years are making, that it feels very unfair to heads and CFOs and HR directors. And so in that way, the fix is sort of a system fix, in terms of just they realize that they don't have a system that potentially might not be equitable. It's definitely not consistent. It's likely not transparent anymore. And so, that's sort of a realm of things that people often feel around the fix. So, certainly happy to go into any of those in more detail, but that's sort of at a high level what I see.
Yeah, no, definitely. We're going to get into get into way more detail. I have a couple more questions though up front. I know when we've talked, you said that faculty compensation is one of the few places where like the law of supply and demand just doesn't work. Um, I guess I'd love for you to explain that and talk about, what forces are overriding the market in independent schools.
Sure. Yeah. So when I give a presentation on this, we look at some data that's put out from ADP is the particular data source that I'm using, but there are multiple data sources that one can consult. But it's sort of showing that the supply of teachers is far below the demand for teachers, and so demand is outpacing supply.
Mm,
And what we know from our basic economics classes, from way back when, is the law of supply and demand. That if there is more demand than there is supply, that typically prices or wages increase to keep up and to match that supply and demand. And that's not happening for faculty, in large part. Faculty, are on a competitive basis relative to other employees, and certainly against other professional employees, are losing ground relative to those employees. Faculty are leaving the profession in huge numbers. Again, you consult multiple data sources for that. And the supply of faculty coming into the market is lower. From the early 1970s, there were about 180,000 degrees conferred in education from higher educational institutions. Fast forward to 2020, that number has fallen in half to around 86,000. Now, we know in independent schools, often our teachers do not hold education degrees, and that's fine. But those numbers certainly are a proxy for the national supply of
100%.
teachers, right? And it shows you the interest that current college students have in going into education is waning. It's by a large measure, right? So why is the law of supply and demand not working? One need only consult the financial model of independent schools, right? We know that in independent schools, roughly two-thirds of the operating budget is personnel costs. There's some variation around that, maybe 60% on the low, maybe 75 on the high, but that two-thirds, that 67% of the operating budget tends to hit most schools in terms of personnel costs. And tuition can only go up by so much in most markets as schools are struggling in many markets to enroll students. And so there's a limit to how high the tuition can go. And so for the corollary to that is there's a limit to how high teacher salaries can be increased unless other creative ways to meet that are met. And I'm sure we'll talk about some of those later. But so it's I think that's why it's not working is really the financial model. And the other thing that's interesting, unlike other things in the economy, there are not efficiencies to be gained in large part by technology going forward, because efficiency in education would be that, one year we taught with one teacher to 18 student ratio. The next year, because of technology, and listen, we AI and all that's, certainly helping teachers in some workload. And there's a whole thing there that we can talk about, right? But I don't think AI or any other technology is going to mean that we're going to see a track of efficiency in teaching where the next year it's 1 to 20, 1 to 22. And you see where I'm going. Eventually, you'd be one teacher to 60 students, and that would be an efficient model that would allow for higher wages for fewer teachers. And that's not the model we have in independent schools, nor am I suggesting it should be. So solving that I mean, it's in many ways, unfortunately, problems. There are problems to be solved. I'm not sure this is a problem to be solved, but rather a dilemma to be managed in schools. I don't think there's a silver bullet. I don't think there's it really is trying to make the most with limited resources.
And another thing that you've talked about as well is like there are these implicit contracts that employees have with their employers. And, it used to be that there was a loyalty contract, right? We would just stay loyal to our employer, stay there for a long time. And now, over time, it shifted more towards this lifestyle contract, which very well may explain why the number of degrees, higher ed degrees have been halved, right? Because last I checked, like if you're expecting a remote or a hybrid experience, that's really hard to deliver on in a brick and mortar school environment. So I guess, knowing that, what shifts do schools need to think about as they're looking at these kind of new contracts that, and I'm not saying legal contracts, but I'm talking about like
Right.
relational contracts that employees are expecting from their employers.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And giving credit where credit's due, I first actually heard Brett Jacobson, current president of SAIS, talking about this at one of his addresses, maybe at his first annual conference. And so, of course, this being an area I work in, I went deeper and read some of the resources that he provided, and one of those being a very large Mercer study across the HR sort of world. And so, yeah, it's this idea that sort of in the 20th century and maybe still in some schools, or at least in some school heads and maybe even in some faculties, sort of this idea of the loyalty contract, right? And so in that, it's this idea of there's a very clear exchange of pay and benefits for time and output. And, it really is the idea of, back in the day when employees would go and stay at a company for 15, 20, 25 years and earn the pension and all of that, right? That was sort of the idea. And that's just not the reality any longer of the way the world works, including pensions are no longer offered. It's not a defined benefit plan, but a defined contribution plan, meaning you put in your money in a 401k or a 403b and hope that it is invested well and grows. So there's that shift from that idea to really, it moved through what Mercer called an engagement contract to then a Thrive contract. And then the lifestyle contract is sort of what's really emerging post pandemic. And that's this idea of the exchange being continued relevance for total rewards, including flexibility. And so it's a whole different mind shift, in terms of what employees are seeking from their jobs versus what they did, say in the 20th century. And so, there are some, especially I think for schools, this is a real concern and challenge, because the idea of flexibility at work, the idea, I mean, from the study, they said that basically 3 in 5 employees will only join a company if they can work remotely or hybrid. And so, that's pretty staggering for schools, because, we need, in large part, for faculty and staff to be at school, taking care of children, with them. And, if the pandemic taught us anything, it's that there is an incredible value on place-based education, the need for students to be physically together, and for parents, for for their children to be cared for while they work and seek, the things that they have to do. So I think that flexibility piece is really, really tough. And I mean, I think there's some examples and reports of some public schools that experimented on the edges of that. Things like a 4-day school week that every Friday is a day off, and so it's a Monday through Thursday. And yeah, I mean, that's giving another day off. It's giving long weekends. But I'm not sure really that's the same kind of flexibility, and I'm not sure that goes as far as thinking about how a school designs its compensation system to have even more built in, if not flexibility, certainly rewards. And again, easier said than done, but I think it's a real challenge for schools.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about systems right now. I mean, you've talked about how a compensation redesign should start as a closed system. I'm curious, like, why is like talk about the framing of that. I'm really curious about it. And do schools tend to resist this? I'm totally like curious about this.
Sure, no, that's great. And so, first of all, I'll start with kind of a definition of what, at least how we think about it when we say a system. When we say the compensation system, we're thinking about, I think as educators, we love a three-legged stool. So, in this case, I have a three-legged stool for you, right? So one is salary design, and that is, what is the mechanism? What is what is what are the mechanics of how salary is determined for each faculty and staff member at the school? So the first piece is the design of salary. And so, within that, there could be, for faculty especially, there could be step and lane, or a salary scale, two names for the same thing. There could be a tiered or banded system. You could have elements of stipends, you could have elements of performance pay, recognition pay. So that's the salary design, right? Then we think about evaluation and professional growth. We group those as one other leg of the stool, and that is, how are you evaluating, faculty, particularly if there is performance pay or differential pay within a salary system with stipends or bands. The evaluation system needs to inform that differential pay, and then professional growth, which I put it together in terms of this part of the system, but we have a very strong opinion that evaluation and professional growth should be two separate things. They work, in conjunction with one another, but they should be separated. They should be two different systems. And then the third and final piece, or the third and final leg of the stool, is benefits, right? So how benefits are delivered to employees. So those are the sort of the three things that sort of make up the compensation system. So yeah, so when we're doing an exercise of redesigning the system, one, we're going to look at all three legs of the stool. And then two, we're gonna tell the faculty, the staff, the administrators, and potentially the trustees that are involved that, as an intellectual exercise, and as a design challenge, right? That we're going to do it as a closed system, meaning the same dollars that are in the budget today are what you should be designing for. It would be pretty easy to say, hey, you've got an extra million or 2 million or whatever is meaningful to your budget to distribute. How do you want to distribute that? That's a very different design challenge than, there are finite resources, as there are in all independent schools, and within those finite resources, how do you want to optimize the design for delivering those resources through salary design, through benefits and evaluation, professional growth. I mean, there's some cost there, but mainly the resources are salary design and benefits. So for example, if you want to enhance a benefit, let's say tuition remission, or let's say pay more for family medical coverage, then within a closed system, you're going to have to lower the pool of money available for salaries. And likewise, if you want more salary dollars, then you're going to have to give up some benefits. And
Right.
so that intellectual exercise, that design challenge, produces, I think, the purest form of optimizing the system. Now, at the end of these projects with our clients, and even when we did this at my school at Gulliver back in 2019, it is very common that the need to fuel the resource engine more is apparent, right? And so we're not saying that don't add more dollars when you're done with this, right? Because you very well could and should do that. And again, many of our clients see, wow, we did benchmarking and we realized we're only paying at the 25th percentile of a competitive set of schools. We want to get to the median, but that's not an excuse to be sloppy in the design, right? So, well, if everybody's gonna get raises, we don't have to optimize. We still want to optimize, and then if we're able to then inject more funds into the system afterwards, great, all the better. Optimizing it can also unlock more dollars, certainly through trustee eyes. I mean, I've worked with schools where the finance committee said things like, "I had no idea we were only paying faculty the 25th percentile. We're, this quality of school. Why we've got to be at least at the median." And so they will, through potentially larger tuition increases or through, working the budget, they will find more dollars available for faculty and staff salaries. Maybe a benefit is really particularly underfunded or poor relative to peers. And so there's a need to inject more cash in that. So it can certainly happen afterwards, but going through the exercise of design, we want to look at it as a closed system.
Yeah, and I guess the big takeaway for me there is like you need to have a system that's going to pass the test of time, right? Whether you add more to it over time, you inject more into it. That's a entirely different conversation. But you need that foundational structure. Am I reading that right?
Absolutely. Yeah, that absolutely. Yeah. And that structure gives transparency, it gives predictability. I mean, and those are some of the most important things when I talk with faculty. Transparency, predictability,
Yeah.
fairness, equity, all of those things. And if if this, if you don't have a strong system that's again, in writing that you can make available to anyone, then you're going to be very at risk for not meeting those things. And so, transparency is an interesting one. Like this is not. I mean, obviously if there's a salary scale, step and lane, I should also say our firm is agnostic as to which sort of these our clients adopt, right? Because each of these have pros and cons.
Right.
Each of these can be right in different school settings, and so, but with salary scale and step and lane, if you know the years experience and the degrees earned of the teachers on your left and on your right, going down the hall, well then yeah, you know exactly kind of what everyone is making. With a tiered and banded system, you're not going to know with that same level of certainty, but it is still transparent because you've been clear on the front end of how it works. Like, here's how you unlock dollars. Here's how you move across tiers. Here's what, so there's a level of transparency in that, if not every teacher knowing what every teacher at the school makes, which, for some, that's what they want. And, and if you go with the tiered or banded system, you just have to be clear through communication that they're not going to have. That's not the
Yeah.
appropriate
But
level of transparency.
But you will know what you need to do in order to move, to wherever you wanna move to, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah. Hey, one of the things that I've been meaning to ask you about is, like, you talk about how clearly defining a full-time, faculty member's, role is a prerequisite for any serious compensation work. Why is that?
Yeah, so we start there, and so that's a great question. So when we're helping schools do this, we sort of give the salary design committee, a couple of tasks. One is we ask them to articulate a compensation philosophy. That's really the device that anchors the system to the mission. And the next thing we ask them to do is to define the role of the full time teacher. You really have to do that in order to set this is the base expectations of every teacher at the school. And for multi-division schools, there can certainly be differences among the divisions. But usually when I see these lists, you'll see like, here are all the things that are in common. And then here are the things that might sort of like be a little different by division, homeroom, self-contained classrooms versus number of sections, things like that. But there's so much that's the same. And it's important that you have that so that one, everyone again is clear about this all is sort of part of the job. And again, back to this sort of lifestyle contract thing, in the old days, if you will, sort of the other duties as assigned clause that we often had in contracts, sort of was carte blanche to just sort of like ask faculty to do whatever. Well, under the lifestyle contract, like, no, that doesn't work for modern, faculty members, right? Let's be very clear about what the expectations are, and I'll do those, and maybe not do a whole lot more unless you're paying me for it, right? And that's just sort of more the modern mindset. So being very clear about that. If you are going to continue to employ stipends in your system, that also sort of shows the line of demarcation of these things are in the base salary. And then now here are the things that might be outside of that over and above that potentially could be deserving of a stipend. And
Such a
so,
good point. Yeah.
yeah, and through the process, there's an opportunity to reset this. Like at my school at Gulliver, when I joined in 2018, found that there were a lot of stipends that, and this happens in schools, right? Every small extra task, someone wants a stipend for it. And so we tried to pull those back, include more in the base salary, and then really limit the number of stipends we had over and above that. And the only way you can do that is if you clearly sort of, make, a clear definition of a full-time teacher.
Yeah. We just talked about step and lane and banded or tiered a second ago. I just I want to pull that thread a little bit more. Like, if you had to break down the pros and cons of each, if you were talking to somebody, like, how would you lay it out?
Yeah, I mean, the big one for step and lane is that it's it is very transparent. It's predictable. It feels more objective. I mean, there's no subjective measures there. Here it is, right?
Yeah.
It's easy to administer, and it's perceived as fair and equitable, and it is fair and equitable on the variables of degrees earned and years experience, right?
Right.
So in that sense, but then on the con side for that is there's zero flexibility for administration. Now maybe you could have a hybrid step and lane where you build in a little flexibility, but a pure step and lane is no flexibility for administration, and that's where there's that pull to like violate it, right? Because you have to get this teacher in this critical area.
Yeah.
And then that's where stipends often come in. Well, I'll create these little stipends that kind of get you where you want to be, and those were sort of even made up
And that's
themselves.
where it spider webs really quickly, right?
Correct.
Yeah.
Exactly. Another con of it is there's really no opportunity for, early or mid-career advancement. Like if you want to move up as a teacher, you just got to bide your time. The other thing about it is that it's based on, years experience and degrees obtained, and all the educational research shows that that does not actually correlate to effective instruction and student outcomes. And so here's an entire system based on two things that don't actually impact learning specifically. And closely related to that is that it does not recognize very varying levels of contribution to the school and to the mission, right? Because that person who goes above and beyond and is the ambassador for the school and all these things, they get the same, and so then it sort of does not incentivize that activity, right? So that's sort of the rundown on step and lane for a banded or a tiered system. Also, I should note that banded and tiered pay systems are the most common among. That's how most people in the U.S. are paid outside of education. So
Mhm.
it's by far and away, outside of education, the most common system that's used. But you get into education, obviously, it's not necessarily, although there's growing adoption. But here, there's a lot of flexibility. You do have those pathways for early in career, early mid career advancement, and it does reward varying levels of contribution to the mission if you set it up right. So those are sort of the pros. And so in many ways, you can see these are sort of like opposite sides of the same coin, right? The cons are it is more complex. It can be perceived by some faculty as being subjective, and so that's something you sort of have to manage in terms of what are the things that get you into different tiers, and so
Right.
kind of managing that. Again, it isn't necessarily a con, but just a note that if performance is a factor I mentioned earlier, you must have a reliable evaluation system, and we know how difficult faculty and staff evaluation is. And then it's less predictable for budgeting because you don't know, the CFO doesn't know, well, I can accurately predict everyone's going to move up one step in the system, and we may have a few new hires, but that's it. Here, you're going to have some new hires, and you may have people moving across some of these bands or tiers, so that can be a little harder for budgeting. So that's the general rundown on it. Like I said, there's no perfect system, so it's something that we sort of have to live with those. We've been a student of the MBOA research, obviously led by Patrick Sherman, another great voice in this space. Their research was amazing. 405 schools included in that. For those of us who watched that research as it was taking place, and then the findings came out, we were hoping that they were going to find these examples of systems that are new and innovative, and wow, now that we've discovered it, we just all need to move to that system and adopt it. And they didn't find any such system. Like that, we're sort of stuck with the ones we've been talking about. The other thing that's interesting from that research is that regardless of the headline name or of the system, the two variables that still most predicted faculty compensation are years experience and degrees obtained. And so that's pretty interesting. So even if a school had a banded or tiered system, the correlation to years experience and degrees obtained still predicted salary for faculty in that school greater than anything else. So that's an interesting note. I mean, in one ways, you could maybe take that to be fatalistic, to say, well, does it even really matter what our system is? And so I don't read it that way. It's just interesting to know that, and to note it, because I still think there's a lot of opportunity with optimizing the system.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of history behind that too, right? So, if you're going to move into a new direction, then I imagine maybe that shifts over time.
Yeah, I think you could see that for sure. And yet, I still think that especially years experience as teachers are at the school longer. and have the opportunity for more impact, they're going to find themselves moving. If it's left or right in the tiered or band system, they're going to find themselves moving towards those upper tiers.
100%.
So it'd be interesting to do kind of a before and after, right? On that, with the school, starting, and then 5-10 years later. We've not done that yet, but it would be interesting to see.
Yeah, that'd be fascinating research for sure. Hey, Cliff, last question for today. If a head of school called you and said, We can't compete on salary alone, but we're still losing people," where would you tell them to focus beyond just say like base pay? And, for in your mind, what are some of the things that are actually moving the needle right now?
Yeah, I think I think it's tough. I mean, independent schools. I mean, going way back, NAI has sort of had a general recommendation that independent schools should pay between 80 to 90% of their local, sort of public school market. There was always this idea that independent schools could pay less than what public schools were paying because we offered, maybe less student load, a different environment, mission driven organization, all the things that sort of come with being an independent school. And I'm not sure for the modern workforce that those things are as compelling, right? And
Mm.
so, I think that is a challenge. And so, if there is a way certainly to highlight the, sort of the teaching load, to highlight sort of the benefits of being in the community, thinking about sort of, the different benefits that are available at the school, where there's a way to have some flexibility, if that can be created, again. So I think it's a real challenge with the modern workforce. And so I don't think there's any one thing that I'm seeing schools do. It's really more diving deep into this work to make sure that the entire system is optimized, and in optimizing the system, at least with our process, it is incredibly inclusive of faculty voice and faculty participation and engagement in designing the new system or redesigning the current system. And I think there's a lot of mileage that heads and schools gain from that. I know I did at Gulliver when we did this work back in 2019, especially I was a new president. I've been there, really one full year when we dove into this work. And so just the fact that you are willing to open up this topic with the faculty and to invite them in and to have meaningful conversations, and for them to understand the limitations
Right.
of the budget and the constraints, and to have, so I think there's a lot to be gained if a head, finds themselves in that situation. I think taking a broad look that involves a lot of faculty participation is likely the way to go versus trying to think, well, there's one or two quick levers I can pull and it's just going to fix it. I think it's the problems tend to be more systemic than that and require that broader look.
Cliff, if somebody wants to follow up, what's the best way for them to do that?
Yeah, perfect. No, they can certainly reach out to me. My email is ckling, it is Kling, at missionanddata.com. Find me on our website, missionanddata.com. Message me there. I'm also on LinkedIn. Find me there. Send me a direct message there. Get back to you. Would love to have the conversation.
Fantastic, all the ways. Cliff Kling, Mission and Data. Thank you again, my friend. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. Great to be with you all.
Great. And for those of you who are members of Moonshot Lab, we're going to transition to the next part of the podcast in just a second. For those of you who aren't, thanks for listening, and I look forward to seeing you on the next podcast.